Okay, I would like to welcome everybody to the Words Festival. This is fantastic. It's great to see everybody here today. I have with us Julianne Hazlewood, who is the host of CBC Radio 1's London Morning, heard weekdays, and you guys all know this because you're avid CBC listeners, from 6 to 8:30 a.m. on 93.5 FM. Julianne joins the CBC from the CBC Saskatoon, where she spent the last year hosting the station's radio show, morning show. Julianne has worked her way across Canada with CBC as a host, reporter, video journalist, producer, and writer. She's returning to London, where she graduated with her master's degree in journalism here from Western. So it's really fantastic to have Julianne back in London, Ontario. I'm going to throw it over to you, Julianne.
All right. Okay, thank you so much, Josh. I feel pleased, honored, privileged, all the adjectives, to be sitting next to Nino Ricci and Jane Urquhart. Over the last few weeks in the lead up today, I have reintroduced myself to some of their work, and I would say on the most basic level, the biggest similarity I saw between their novels was not even within the first chapter, within the first couple of pages, they just transported me to another world rich in characters, time, and place. So I'm really excited to get to pick their brains to figure out how the heck they do that in the most beautiful of ways. So first I'd like to give a little bit of an introduction about Nino and Jane. Nino Ricci is no stranger to southwestern Ontario. He was born in Leamington, and he is currently the Alice Munro Chair of Creativity at Western University. His novels have won many awards, including the Governor General's Award for Fiction. He's a two-time winner of that, and he's the recipient of the Alistair MacLeod Award for Literary Achievement. In 2011, he was appointed a member of the Order of Canada. And Jane Urquhart is the author of 7 internationally acclaimed novels. Her awards include Le Prix du Meilleur Livre Étranger, Best Foreign Book Award, the Governor General's Award, and the Trillium Award, and she has also written a few books of poetry, and she too was named an officer of the Order of Canada in 2005. So Nino and Jane, welcome. It's great to have you here today. I'd like to start by asking both of you to do a reading for us. So you can take to the podium or sit here and do the reading and talk about what you're reading and take it away. So whoever would like to go first, yes.
It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be in London and at the university. I've been having a wonderful time and a very enriching time there, and I'm looking forward to the next 2 years being part of this city. I'm also very heartened to see how thriving the Words Fest is, and looking forward to future ones. I'm going to read from my most recent novel, Sleep. It's a novel that was very loosely inspired by a sleep disorder that I came down with about a dozen years ago. And up until then, I had thought very little about sleep. I'd taken it utterly for granted. And I was to pay the price for that, as it turned out. But as I started studying sleep, I grew fascinated with it and began to realize what an interesting thing it was and how stupid I had been to not pay more attention to it earlier. And what a varied thing it is, how much actually goes on while we sleep. We tend to think of sleep as simply the off switch in our brain, but in fact our brains are very active during sleep, active during REM sleep, of course, when we dream, and our dreams, it turns out, play all kinds of crucial roles in our lives. They help form memories, they help downgrade aggression, they help reassert our sense of self, so that if we have a bad day one day and go to sleep, in our dreams will actually work out all that resentment we're bearing toward some boss or coworker, so that when we wake up in the morning, we're refreshed and ready to face the day and have our egos restored. And of course, they They help us repair our bodies and basically to live healthy, well-balanced lives. Studies that were done with rats that were prevented from sleeping found that within 13 days they started dying. That in fact, in some ways, you could go longer without food than without sleep. So that started this novel. My character has a disorder, though as I got into the novel, the whole issue of sleep began to take on sort of bigger metaphorical implications as well, implications about the way we live now and about the way in which the digital age has changed our consciousness, perhaps in some fundamental ways. I'm just going to read from the beginning of the book. First chapter is called Methylphenidate. A wash of chemicals floods David's brain, and at once the urge is there, irresistible. What is the trigger? What switch opens the floodgate? If he could find it, he could control it. But even to think of the urge is to bring it on. Dad. Dad. These are the times it overtakes him, when he is reading, when he is watching, when he is listening. At the crossroads of action and thought, the mind's gathering place, the very place where he lives. When he is driving. Daddy, wake up. He hears a thundering like a stampede. He sees chariots, horses. Then the image splinters and there is only the noise itself, jagged and black, until finally the expressway pixelates into clarity and he realizes he has veered onto the rumble strip. A car is stopped on the shoulder, not 100 meters in front of them. They are headed straight for it. Dad, there's a car. Afterwards, David will never quite be able to sort out his memory of what happens next in any way that makes sense. It will seem as if he is split in two. On one side of him, the nuclear blast of sensation, the thump of his wheels, the stopped car, his son's grating terror. In the other, an eerie calmness, as if every fiber in him has long been preparing for just such a moment when everything hangs in the balance. He will be amazed how much data has been left in him by an event that has happened in the blink of an eye. The slant of autumn light through the windshield. The color of the car, silver gray, he is heading toward. The look of its driver, a small, dark-skinned man, Middle Eastern or Asian, who has stopped to make a call or stretch his legs or take a leak as he innocently turns to check for traffic before opening his door, only to discover that death is bearing down on him. And already before it comes, David sees the crash, the mess of twisted metal and broken glass and ruined flesh. He jerks the wheel hard and the car bucks like a wild animal, no longer under his will. His body has braced itself for impact, but impossibly, the impact doesn't come. Instead, there is only a suck of air from the far side of the car, like the pull of something's gravity, the scream of a horn as David overshoots his lane and nearly sideswipes a passing van. Then, as quickly as that, the danger is past, as if it had never been. Already the car on the shoulder has receded to a harmless glint in the rearview mirror. David's heart is pounding. He digs his little pill container out of his pant pocket and dumps the pills onto the passenger seat, then grabs two by feel and crunches down on them. Do not chew. They are bitter like cyanide, like hemlock, but pointless now. He is fully awake. He can feel Marcus eyeing him from his car seat in the back. You fell asleep, he says. I wasn't asleep. But already David has taken to the wrong tack, has responded to the boy's accusation rather than to his fear. I just closed my eyes for a second, that's all, because of the sun. David nudges the mirror to get a better view. A better view of him, sees how his shoulders have hunched, how he has balled himself up in his gloom and distrust. He is barely 5, but already he carries his moves like an adolescent. At the zoo where they were visiting, he fell into a sulk over a trinket David refused him at the gift shop, and now he will roll this new, larger hurt into the old one, each lending weight to the other. When did he become like this, so vigilant, so hungry for grievance? David knows he ought to say more about what has happened, but is afraid that saying more will only raise the event's importance in the boy's mind, will only make him more likely to report it to his mother. Sit up straight, please. We've talked about that. A thin line of fire burns a path through David's veins as the drug enters his bloodstream, and he feels a panic go through him. Nothing like the adrenal rush of the near accident itself, but a sense of being vulnerable after the fact, as if by some loop the moment might replay itself differently. He realizes suddenly that his whole body is trembling. It happens sometimes when he is agitated, this loss of control, another of his symptoms. The sheerest luck has saved him from killing his son. He casts another look back at Marcus. Almost home now, he says, almost there. A hesitation, then the inevitable question. Will Mama be there? He is never enough. He is never the last resort. David lets the question hang. Thank you.
Well, hello. It's great to be back in London, and it's wonderful to be here, actually, as a part of Western University event, but also to be in the London Museum is just such a pleasure. I have a long history here, I have a long attachment. My husband works in the collection. My stepson Aidan has works in the collection. It just goes on and on. The family just keeps on being connected to London. Aidan still lives here, of course, and Tony, however, ran away to Eastern Ontario with me after he finished being chairman at the University of Waterloo. But he began, long before I knew him, at the University of Western Ontario as the first curator, in fact, of the Macintosh Gallery and their first artist in residence. And that was a very long time ago. And I won't embarrass him by telling you how long, but you can probably find out. But it brings it sort of full circle in a way, because here's my old friend Nino, who is very young, my young friend Nino, who's much younger than me, in fact, here as the first Alice Munro Chair in Creativity. So it's kind of amazing how London just keeps coming back over and over again in discussions about the arts in Ontario. It's really quite a unique place, and one that figures largely in the history of both literature and art, and many other things as well. So it's always a pleasure to be here. What I thought I would do would be give you two tiny samples of two of my books, and then rush over there and have this wonderful conversation with Julianne and Nino. I thought I'd read from a little tiny bit from my most recent novel, The Night Stages, and just to kind of set it in Ireland. I found that I have a tendency now to make use of almost every single person that I meet, so don't talk to me for too long. Otherwise, there could be real trouble. But this particular section is based on a poet that I knew, an Irish Gaelic poet, in fact, a man called Michael Kirby, who lived to the age of 98, which was really extraordinary, and kept writing. He was also a fisherman in the west of Ireland, and just a wonderful, brilliant man. He wrote in both Irish Gaelic and in English, and translated himself back and forth from each. I turned him into my main character's bicycle race coach in this particular book, something I think he would have enjoyed. And thankfully, his family just thought that was the best thing ever. So I was very lucky in that regard. So I'm just going to read you a little bit about what Michael Kirby has to say to a young man who's in fact training for something called the Ross in Ireland, which is an Irish bicycle long-distance race that goes for about 3 or 4 days in Ireland, and was kind of, in fact, established by the IRA in the 1950s to just as a kind of nationalist sport. It's still happening if anyone wants to participate. They take international entries, but this particular section takes place in the 1950s. Michael Kirby talking about potholes. On one of those days, Kieran arrived 5 minutes early, and Kirby allowed that he was impressed, but not overly impressed, he said, raising one hand in a cautionary manner. Not impressed enough. There is something we need to talk about. Tell me everything you know about potholes, he said. 2 months before, Kieran had blown a tire when he encountered a pothole on the flat stretch of bog that provided an otherwise leisurely and joyful ride through inviting open country after the effort of Ballacasheen. There's that devil of a one after the pass, he said. A very dangerous pothole indeed, Kirby said, but not dangerous now for you, as you know it is there, which apparently Oisin did not. Still, there are potholes all over the island, and you must become intimate with each of them before you join the Ross. Kirby stood in the parlor. The importance of the lecture, he said, merited such formal surroundings. He told Kieran about the potholes of County Tipperary, the specifics of potholes on the roads that ran by the rivers of Clare. Potholes in bog country, he explained, were of an entirely different nature, deeper and more likely to shift from one day to the next. Shape changers, he said. He spoke of the angry potholes of County Galway with their mouths of stone. Be wary, he warned, of the deceptive potholes of County Dublin. They have macadamized roads there, he said, and because of this, a rider can become too confident of a smooth surface. In County Cork, he confided, they have every kind of pothole that God can create. Those cork holes, he maintained, were like the kind of potholes that lay in wait for you, like dogs hiding in a bush near the ends of lanes they are bound and determined to protect. You never see them, he warned, until they catch you by the pant leg. He could not speak about the North, he said, they being British potholes, that Kieran should be cautious indeed around that territory. They have potholes, I'd say, like landmines up there, veritable craters waiting for a cyclist from the south. The idea of the North was not something that Kieran had thought about. Surely, he said, the Ross would not really go there, would it? It had been a particular point of honor, Kirby insisted, for the Ross to penetrate the border at some time or another on one of the northern stages. During the inaugural Ross, he reminded him, the boys had carried the Irish flag with them, weaving in and out through the 6 counties, and there had been much comment upon it by the Orangemen and the Royal Ulster Constabulary. Quite a fracas had ensued, and these detours had been discouraged since. Kirby rose from his chair after the pothole lecture and walked toward one of the 2 shelves of books on either side of the hearth. This, he said, handing a dark leather volume to Kieran, is what you must read to understand the formation and persistence of potholes. Kieran looked at the spine. Geology of Ireland, it read. Different rocks, different soils give birth to varying potholes. Know what's under you, Kirby said when you were riding. Remember the Ice Age, that fractional inching forward of everything you think is stable. Learn how water affects what's under you, and never forget, everything, even hard stone, is moving slightly at all times. The truth was, Kirby insisted, you could count on absolutely nothing. What began as a barely noticeable crack could blossom overnight into a gigantic sinkhole that could swallow you and your bicycle in one gulp. Kieran hadn't wanted to mention the irrefutable fact that he had never once seen Kirby on a bicycle and had never even heard of him riding at any time, but he couldn't help himself. How do you know all this, he asked now. Have you ridden on these roads? Kirby looked surprised. "Of course not," he said. "I'm a fisherman. The only thing I have ridden are the waves." "So how do you know then?" Kirby looked out the window of his house and up the road that climbed to Molise Head. "The donkey of the imagination," he said, "can travel anywhere." Then he began to recite a poem. "To a pothole," he began. "O gaping mouth, O teeth of stone, hiding in the path of those who go down from the fields to town. Wagon spiller, interrupter of wheels, on roads that speed a shining bike along between the mountains, under which you lurk with your lap full of yesterday's rain and your shoes full of yesterday's dirt." Thank you. And now I'm just going to read the opening page of the Stone Carvers, and I thought I'd do that since it is November and we're coming up to Remembrance Day. In June of 1934, two men stand talking in the shadow of the great unfinished monument. Behind them rises a massive marble base flanked by classically sculpted groups of figures and surmounted by an enormous stone woman who is hooded and draped in the manner of a medieval mourner. At her back, a shed-like building occupies the space between twin obelisk-shaped pylons, each with their own wooden rooms attached to them at a great height. The taller man wears a dark overcoat and hat and carries a pole about the size of a walking stick that he swings out in front of him now and then as if to make a point. The other man, less formally clad in an oilskin jacket buttoned tightly over his round belly, appears to be more involved in the conversation, looking intently at his companion and rising on his toes and opening his arms while he is speaking. All around them, all around the monument, is a sea of men and mud, except in the far distance where the dark mountains of the cold fields of Long can be seen to the northeast, and the white slabs of graveyards, some only partially sodded, can be seen to the south and to the west. Despite the fact that the ground the men stand on is French and the month is June, it is not a warm day. There is no sun, and the wind howls across the coal fields toward the monument in increasingly strong gusts, so that the taller man is forced to place a hand on his hat. At one point, both men stop talking and look up at a large wooden shed that stands on a forest of scaffolding and is secured by thick ropes to the larger of the two pylons. They listen to the strange noise these ropes make as they rub together, a noise the taller man knows to be remarkably similar to the sound of two pines scraping against each other in a wind-filled Canadian forest. Along with the wind and the sound of the ropes, there is the staccato noise of several stonecutters' tools as men in overalls carve words onto the extensive stone wall. The taller man walks across broken marble and rutted mud to see how this work is going. He says a few words to one of the stone carvers, then returns to his companion. It begins to rain. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jane and Nino. From the work that you just did the readings from, was there a point where you realized, okay, I have something here that I want to write a novel, that I want to write a story of that length? I mean, I guess, how do you know when you really have something there? Either of you can.
We look at each other. I never know if I have something there. That's part of the problem. I have to keep writing in order to find out if I have something there. So for me, I know that I'm intrigued by something. And in the case of the first book that I read from, the Night Stages, I was intrigued by this notion of this crazy bicycle race, particularly since I had lived part-time in the west of Ireland for 20 years, and I knew just how bad those roads were. I mean, they are, and they still are, really bad in the west of Ireland. The roads in the rest of Ireland have improved. But I had been looking at, in a way, it was almost an excuse to be able to, in some sort of quasi-authentic way, because of course, like Kirby, I've never ridden bicycle on those roads in particular, but to be able to write about the Irish landscape. And in the case of the stone carvers, I was really, my husband, Tony, who had been going there since the 1950s, took me several times to see the monument. And the first time I thought, oh gosh, these battlefields, isn't this just like a man? I thought they always want to go to battlefields or football fields or some kind of fields, you know. And so I thought, you know, I wasn't keen on it, but it's impossible not to be affected by that enormously moving piece of gigantic sculpture, and not to mention the little graveyards around France and Belgium, and so I became interested in the man who caused that monument to exist, and then had to write the book to find out why I was so interested.
And Nino, you talked about your issues with sleep. Was there a moment where you felt, I need to write this?
Well, sort of, although this book was unusual for me in that I'd only been thinking about it for about 5 or 6 years when I started it. I mean, what helps me is that I'm such a slow writer that, you know, I get lots of ideas, and I used to keep a notebook of them, and many of them were bad ideas, but the ones that were any good were the ones that sort of stayed with me. And, you know, most of the books I've written go back 10, 15, 20 years. The one I'm working on now goes back to an idea I had in my 4th undergraduate year of university. So if it's lasted, you know, if it stayed with me that long, then chances are there's something there. And also it means that over those years, little bits of things have been accumulating to give it sufficient depth to sustain a novel. And in fact, I had a hard time with sleep because as I say, I'd only been sitting with it for 5 or 6 years, and I didn't really know the character that well, and it sort of took me a while to get to know him in the writing. And it's certainly true that the writing itself is the main discovery phase. So as much as I've been thinking about an idea beforehand, as soon as you start writing, it feels like you've what were you thinking about for those 20 years? Why is your brain so empty? You should have reams of material ready, and yet. But in the process of writing, I think in the first draft phase, you know, stuff starts to come out, and it's only by the end of that draft that it really becomes clear what the story is that you want to tell, and hopefully, so far, it has usually come clear in that phase. It could always happen that you could write that draft and it doesn't cohere, and that's a great terror, certainly.
Well, Jane, you mentioned your friendship with Nino, and I know in the correspondence before, Nino, you had mentioned being on the road with Jane back in your salad days, was it? So do explain, tell us about how far you guys go back.
Well, a very long way. I guess since you published your first novel, really, Lives of the Saints. We were part of something that Nino reminded me. I said, was it Canada Book Week? What was it? We killed it off, I think, that particular thing. But it was National Reading Week, you said. I guess no one in Canada read most of the time, so they had to have a week during which, sort of like reading week at the university. But we went to the Yukon, I seem to remember. Didn't you insult a politician in the Yukon?
According to you, I did.
Yes, it was great.
I did insult the politician, but I didn't realize I was speaking to his wife.
Yes, that was a problem. Yeah. At a dinner party that then became extremely silent and uncomfortable. But Nino and I, well, I mean, I've talked about this before, and I think I could likely assume that you were included in that same moment. There was a moment when Canadian literature was really entering, I suppose, what might have been its second generation. Because for me, I feel that it was, I mean, there were obviously previous writers, but because we weren't studying Canadian literature at university and we were not reading Canadian books in our public school system, for me, it was kind of born with the Margaret Lawrence, Mordecai Richler generation. And Nino and I were lucky enough to be, I think, part of what was the end of that developmental period, but it was still developing. It might have been the end of the developmental period, but it was still an exciting, wonderful, new thing. I mean, there weren't any literary festivals to speak of. I think Harbourfront had begun, but the idea that there would be literary festivals coast to coast to coast in this country, I mean, I never even could have thought of that when I published my first novel. In fact, I couldn't even really think about publishing my first novel. In my case, it was a big surprise to me that anybody wanted to publish my first novel. How about you, Nino? Was it a surprise to you?
Well, most people didn't want to publish my piece.
Well, there you go.
So it was no surprise.
But somebody did publish it
Somebody
first.
did.
And was it successful? Yes, it was. It was a wild success.
You did okay, yeah.
Yeah, so anyway, to continue along those lines, it was, we did go on tour, and that was another thing that used to happen sort of pre-festivals, was that one would be on a book tour. So you were often in the company of another author, or even the way it is now, you see lots of authors as you move back and forth across the country from festival to festival. But then you didn't. And so we had the same editor, the marvelous Ellen Seligman, who was enormously gifted editor, who alas died a couple of years ago. And she came to the conclusion that we should be on the road promoting our books together. But I seem to remember that we read from each other's books on occasion because we were so tired of reading from the book we were promoting.
And nobody noticed.
That's right. No, somebody said to me, you know, your prose style has improved.
Well, I think we discovered, in fact, that we'd written the same book.
Yes, that's
we had
right.
the same motif.
We did, that's right.
Well, one of the themes this year at Words Fest is community. So how important have those relationships, those friendships with other authors, that literary community, how important has that continued to be throughout your careers?
Well, it's very important in that you really need to feel like you're part of a community, a vibrant community, that something is happening out there. And I think, you know, the generation that preceded us really had to sort of create that out of nothing. There was a kind of wasteland out there, not only in terms of, you know, formed literary communities, but in terms of reception. There was very little awareness that a Canadian literature even existed until Atwood published Survival in 70 or 71, and very little sort of public support for it. So certainly the sense that you know, there are other writers doing what you're doing, that this is a valued thing, that people are out there who care about what you're doing, is really a necessary precondition, I think, for
Yes.
successful literary culture.
I think so too, and I think that in a way, I remember, for instance, because I published a couple of collections of poetry, it never even occurred to me that anyone other than perhaps another writer would read my work at all. And so for many people in the beginning, really are not only was there a community, we were sleeping on each other's couches. You know, we would have readings in Saskatchewan, for example, and whoever invited you was almost always another writer, and you could expect maybe 5 or 6 people at a reading, and then you'd have a wonderful time getting to know the other writer and her family, and often you were sleeping on their couch. It was really grassroots, and I think, you know, I feel very nostalgic about those days because they were meaningful in all kinds of different ways. The people who were participating were doing so out of sheer, what do I want to say, determination and love for literature. We really talked about books and about what was moving us in terms of international titles and in terms of Canadian titles. And we have to remember that, I mean, without Longhouse Books, which was one of the first to distribute or to sell Canadian books, without those little bookstores in Canada, the readers wouldn't have had access to Canadian literature. And in fact, I fear we're going back to that model again, because there were a couple of chains, Coles and W.H. Smith, that really literally did not carry Canadian books in Canada. And so we were dependent on we also got to know the booksellers. That was the other thing. We knew all of those booksellers personally. So watching them being put out of business by the big chains was not a happy time.
How have you seen the industry change? Because, yeah, you've both been at this for decades now. How have you seen it change? Has it moved forward in a positive way?
Well, it's been interesting times, I think. There was a golden age in the 90s when, as a result of that first crop of very sort of solid writers, we saw a flourishing of new writers and also a flourishing of voices from different communities, from immigrant communities, from all sorts of perspectives. And we also had a very solid publishing base to support that. We had strong editors, people like Ellen Seligman, Louise Denny's, Iris Tupholme. The big publishers, which, you know, well into, I think, the 80s even, really had very little of a Canadian list, now made Canadian books their priority, as opposed to simply being branch plants of American publishers. And somewhere in the 2000s, that began to change with this increasing monopolization. Right now, there's one family in Germany that owns, I think, most of the publishing in the world. They own Random House, which is now not just Random House. It now includes Knopf. It now includes Doubleday. It now includes Penguin. It now includes, 50% of the books that you see in a bookstore is owned by Bertelsmann, which is this mega publishing giant out of Germany. And they've exercised a certain amount of discretion in allowing these houses to continue to publish a variety of books under their different imprints, but that, you feel the hand tightening year by year, and the budget's getting smaller, and the sense of taking risks is lessening, the going with the sure thing, which feels like a return to the older style of the 80s, where really the small presses have to pick up the slack, and self-publishing is becoming much, much bigger because people now can self-publish. So people are having to find other outlets, and the same thing is happening in book selling, where there's the one big bookstore, which isn't in 10 years will that physical bookstore even exist? You go into an Indigo now and you see candles
and clothes.
Right. Do you think it will exist? I mean, do you think they'll still be selling the physical copies?
Well, they'll be selling more and more candles.
And you see that with Amazon as well. I mean, it's so interesting to see what began as a book seller, essentially, an online bookseller, turning into the biggest distributor of everything and maybe the odd book in the world, So, and I think the other thing that has changed is that, as I said, there were no Canadian literature courses when I went to university. Well, there also were absolutely zero creative writing courses, which I think in my case probably was a good thing, because I'm not sure I could have handled any criticism at that point, mainly because I didn't really even know I hadn't felt entitled to become an author, partly because I grew up in a country where there weren't any authors to speak of, and certainly I had never met one in my immediate family or the surroundings. I'd met great book enthusiasts. My mother was an enormous reader and probably could have and would have been a writer had that opportunity existed for her, but of course it did not. And but now we have many, many, many creative writing programs in universities. And with them or without them, we have so many gifted young writers coming up who are, some of whom are publishing now and some of whom will be publishing in the future. And I think it must be very difficult in ways that you and I probably didn't experience, because while the market is shrinking, the number of writers is increasing, and you know, it's discouraging in some ways, I believe.
Well, I want to pick up on creativity, and you know, especially since you're the Alice Munro Chair of Creativity at Western right now. The creative process. What helps you be creative? What inspires you?
Well, it's a big question.
It is a big question, yeah.
I mean, I think it's true of anyone in any creative field that they come into that field with some kind of obsession or some kind of driving force that puts them there, whether it's physics or medicine or writing. There's something that drives you there and that makes you want to worry away at it. What is that thing? Why would evolution, select for novelists? I don't know. But Jane was saying that her mother would probably be a writer. My father would probably have been a writer. He spent the past 20 years of his life writing an 800,000 word memoir, and it's given tremendous shape and meaning to his life. From somewhere that urge comes, and if that urge is there, then inspiration comes from everywhere. It's not, you don't wake up and get the great idea. You wake up and some little thing catches your attention, and some other thing attaches itself to that little thing, and then suddenly you're thinking about those two things in conjunction, and they snowball. I mean, that's how my books take shape. I did a course in first year university in which we read a bit of Darwin, and something about Darwin just stayed with me. I thought, there's something I don't quite get here, but it seems very, very important. And I kept coming back to it and thinking, well, how do you write a novel about something like this? And then at a certain point, something else came into that, and the idea formed. So in one way, I had this inspiration, but it took 15 years for all the various elements of it to come together.
The other thing I was thinking about is that, I mean, not only does there have to be the spark, but there has to be the opportunity, as I've mentioned before. But that being said, I also believe that there's a kind of inspiration that causes creative people to do the work even if there is no audience, even if there is no success, even if nothing happens, they still feel compelled to make the piece of sculpture, or write the story down, or create the poem. I was just thinking, my daughter, who is also a writer, and she writes nonfiction, in fact, is working on a book about late-stage creativity, about creativity in people who are considered to be, I guess, senior citizens, like her mother. But I don't figure in the book, apparently. But she discovered a woman in New York City who is a painter, who has lived in New York, and who has painted in a little tiny New York apartment for her entire life. She has supported herself financially in other ways, and has had zero success. She's now in her late 80s, and she is still at it. She still tries to get into galleries. She has always tried to get into galleries. She's never had a show. She's never had a sale. And according to my daughter, her work is really very interesting, but she's never had that lucky thing happen. And yet she is filled with this sort of creative energy and wants to keep making the work. So I think that's a big part of it.
And it was interesting when Harper was revising copyright law, he actually used that as an argument for scaling back compensation for artists. He says, we don't need to compensate them because they will do it anyways.
Thankfully, he won't do it anyways.
I don't want to run out of time without opening up to questions, audience questions. So if anybody has a question at this point, please raise your hand and we'll get to it. Yeah, right in front.
I was just interested, you mentioned your father's 800,000-word memoir or autobiography. Did you read it? What did it do for you?
I've read most of it. there are, my brother read it and decided that it could not be distributed.
Censorship.
For libel reasons. In fact, initially I worked with him on it, and because he was having, he went through a whole process. He had to learn how to use a computer. He did English courses. He started writing in English, then switched to Italian, then translated the Italian into English and the English into Italian. He got a tutor to help him improve the English. And at a certain point, I sort of waded in and says, well, Dad, I'll help you sort of clean it up. And I went through the first 50 pages, which took me quite a while. And I said, Dad, I finished the first 50 pages. He says, oh, I changed all of those.
He sounds like the real thing.
So I kind of lost heart. But, you know, it is a fascinating document, particularly the part that deals with his life in Italy, which I knew nothing of. There were things in there that really were true revelations to me. How he came to marry my mother, for instance, is just, it was a fascinating story to me, a bit chilling in ways, but so it was, it's a great value to the family, certainly, to have those stories. And I think, one day I'm probably going to be cannibalizing that book for a novel.
If it ever got up to the point where you were in the book, were you ever
in the book?
Stage of life where you were?
Yes. Well, it's odd, but I find it hard to read the sections of the book that actually are most directly connected to our lives. So I sort of got to the point where that started happening and slacked off. I'm not quite sure why that is. There's this kind of psychological block, but I promise I'll get back to it. It often happens, in fact, that my dad will tell an anecdote and I'll say, I didn't know that. And he'll say, oh, I guess you didn't read my book.
It was in the book. It was in the book. Any other questions? Yeah?
Do you have a formula for dealing with your family?
That's a very good question.
You can never do it because they're always wanting you to do this, do that, go to so your uncle needs this, and blah, blah. How do you get that space where people respect, I'm sorry, but I'm writing in this time?
Now, do you mean concerning the writing itself and getting to it?
Interpret it in any way you want.
Okay. Well, first of all, there's the family, the nuclear family, kids, dogs, husbands, all of that. And I'm quite fortunate in that regard, in that my husband is a creative person, and his deepest wish is that I would stop talking, and he knows while he's painting, because he prefers to listen to classical music, not me, apparently whining about things and demands and making demands. So I'm really the person who's interrupting the creative person. And so he was delighted. He's always delighted when I get seriously involved in a book and withdraw to another room. But I had kids and stepkids and all kinds. Our household in the beginning was wild and crazy and busy. But even that sort of worked in a way, because people were being wild and crazy and busy in their own way. And there was a kind of structure because all of those people, including my husband, went to school. And that meant that there were long periods of time during the day when I was alone in my head, at least. I mean, I had a lot of things to do, like shopping and cooking and laundry and et cetera, but I was still alone in my head, so I could work in my head and I could get some work done. Now, family in terms of, somebody's in your book, that's another whole story. And there are those, I come from a very large Irish tribal family, the Quinns, and many of them believe that they have been in my books when they haven't, and they get mad. And then they're the ones who believe they haven't been in my books, and actually they have, but they don't see themselves in there, and then they get mad and offended because they're left out of it. It's just, and then there are the fact checkers who say things like, Davy Dingwall's general store was on the north side of the road. It was not on the south side of the road, and become offended because there's something that I made up, you know. So family is, it's a wonderful thing, because of course one does mine the family legends and things like that, but they're the people who know you the best and therefore are completely unimpressed with what you're doing. And they're always there. That's all I can say.
Okay, we can get in one more quick question. I already see a hand up at the back. Go ahead.
As literary greats in our times, where do you think the construct and design of words will go in a posthumous kind of venue, which a lot of people talk about now? And my second question is, do you believe in a kind of erasure of the artist behind the work, or do you like to be more prevalent? It sounds like you like to be a little more prevalent. I'm more for the artist or author being very much a part of their own work, and I just wonder what your thoughts were on those two issues.
Big questions. We'll get quick thoughts before we wrap up here. Yeah, okay.
We didn't hear it up here.
Yeah, there was a couple of questions in there. Why don't you just repeat your first one again?
Okay, well, there were two questions in as literary greats.
She'll repeat it.
One is about the future of literary greats. Yeah?
As literary greats in what's been deemed a posthumanist epoch, I was just wondering where you would see the construct of words and designs going.
Okay.
Second question would be, as authors and also artists, do you believe in the principle of erasure, or do you like to be more of a major component within your own works, because you can't get a sense of distance without completely immersing yourself?
Why don't we take on maybe the first question there, because we don't have much
Well,
time.
first of all, I didn't know about this epoch that we were entering. So I'm blissfully.
At the Taft Art Center, one of the poets there talks about the posthumanism.
Okay, posthumanist, is that it? Okay, so, but having been, blissfully unaware of it, I guess that I will be continuing to do what I do regardless, because that's what I do, and I sort of have to continue to do it. My thoughts concerning how, I think that, well, first of all, don't forget, capitalism is pretty dependent on the arts. Maybe not here, but when you think about mass tourism, for example, obviously the arts have a value that is a capitalist value, as well as the real value, in my opinion, is the kind of beauty and thought and reflection that they bring into our lives. But from the point of view of someone running a multinational mass tourism business, you've got to have some place to take the tourists. So I don't see, for instance, the Venice being leveled, or the art galleries throwing out all their old masters. And there, again, we have to think about the fact that not only do they have this wonderful intrinsic value in that they have enriched our lives over the years, but masterpieces are worth a lot of money. So I think it's possible that they will, I think it's probable that they will survive. I mean, if planet Earth survives, and that's really all I can say about that, but I will check that out for sure.
Okay, we have got to wrap it there. Jane Urquhart, Nino Ricci, thank you so much.
I'd like to thank Julianne as well.